5. Psychological reasons to love silence. You've been told your whole life that there's something wrong with you for preferring silence, for choosing solitude, for not wanting to fill every moment with noise and conversation, and the constant performance of being social, and you've internalized that message, started to believe that your love of quiet means you're broken, antisocial, missing some fundamental human need for connection that everyone else has but you don't. And so you force yourself into situations that drain you, into conversations that feel empty, into social gatherings where you're present physically but absent mentally, because all you can think about is when you can leave, when you can get back to the silence that everyone else seems to fear, but you crave like oxygen, and they don't understand it. They think you're depressed or stuck up or just weird. They think silence is absence, emptiness, something to be avoided, something to be filled immediately with music or podcasts or small talk, anything to keep the quiet at bay. But for you, silence isn't empty, it's full, it's where you think clearly, where you process deeply, where you exist without the constant pressure to perform, to entertain, to be anything other than exactly what you are. And loving silence doesn't make you broken, it makes you different. It makes you someone who understands that not all valuable things are loud, that depth happens in quiet, that the most important conversations are often the ones you have with yourself, and the world needs to stop pathologizing that. Needs to stop treating preference for silence like it's a disorder. Needs to understand that some people aren't avoiding connection. They're seeking a different kind of connection. One that happens in stillness rather than chaos, in depth rather than breadth, in the quiet spaces where real thought can actually occur. You feel guilty when you want to be alone, like wanting solitude means you're rejecting people, when really you're just protecting your energy, protecting your ability to think, protecting the part of you that only exists in silence. People say you're too quiet, like quiet is a crime, like your value is measured by how much noise you make, how many words you contribute, how visible you are. You go to social events and leave exhausted, not energized, drained by the constant stimulation, the shallow conversations, the performance of interest in topics you don't care about with people you don't connect with. You've been called antisocial so many times, you started to believe it, started to think there's something fundamentally wrong with the fact that you'd rather spend Friday night alone than at a party. That you'd rather sit in silence than engage in small talk, that you recharge in solitude while others recharge in groups. You try to be more social, more outgoing, more like the people who seem to thrive in noise and chaos. But it never works. You always end up feeling like you're wearing someone else's skin, playing a role that doesn't fit, exhausting yourself trying to be someone you're not just to prove you're not broken, when the only thing that's broken is the assumption that everyone should want the same things, should be energized by the same environments, should find fulfillment in constant connection rather than intentional solitude. Here's what actually happened. You were born with a nervous system that processes information deeply, that gets overwhelmed by too much stimulation, that needs quiet to integrate experience, to think without interference, to exist without the constant bombardment of input that extroverted environments provide. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not a defect, that's just how your brain works. But you grew up in a world designed for extroverts, a world that rewards loudness, that equates silence with emptiness, that treats solitude like loneliness and quiet like absence. And so you learn to see your natural state as something wrong, something to fix, something to apologize for, when really it's just different. Just a valid way of being human that doesn't get represented, doesn't get celebrated, doesn't get normalized because the people who prefer silence aren't the ones making noise about it. Aren't the ones demanding representation, aren't the ones creating content, because creating content requires putting yourself out there in a way that feels antithetical to everything you value. And so you stay invisible, stay unrepresented, stay believing you're the only one who feels this way when really there are millions of people like you. People who love silence, who need it, who find in it what others find in conversation, who aren't broken or antisocial or depressed, just different, just wired for depth instead of breadth, for quality instead of quantity, for silence instead of noise. The brutal truth is this: loving silence is psychologically healthy. It's not avoidance, it's not isolation, it's not a sign that something's wrong with you. It's a sign that you understand something most people don't, which is that silence creates space for thought, for integration, for the kind of deep processing that's impossible in constant stimulation. And the 5 reasons you love silence, the 5 psychological advantages you have that loud people don't, they're real, they're measurable. They're the reason you think differently, create differently, exist differently than the people who can't stand to be alone with their thoughts for 5 minutes. First, silence gives you clarity. It removes the noise that clouds judgment, that creates reactive thinking, that keeps people operating on autopilot. And in that clarity, you can actually think, can actually process, can actually arrive at conclusions that aren't just echoes of whatever you heard last. Second, silence builds autonomy. It teaches you to be comfortable with yourself, to not need external validation, to find security in your own company rather than in constant connection. And that autonomy, that self-sufficiency, that makes you less manipulable, less dependent, less likely to compromise yourself for acceptance. Third, silence enhances creativity. It's where ideas develop, where connections form, where the subconscious has space to work without being interrupted by constant input. And every great creative work, every breakthrough, every innovation, it came from someone who spent time in silence, who understood that creation requires space, requires quiet, requires the ability to listen to what's emerging rather than what's being broadcast. Fourth, silence protects your energy. It prevents the drain that comes from constant social performance, from managing relationships, from processing other people's emotions. And that protection, that conservation of energy, that's what allows you to actually do things, to create things, to build things, instead of spending all your energy just maintaining social connections that don't actually serve you. Fifth, silence reveals truth. It strips away the performance, the pretense, the social lubrication that keeps people from saying what they actually think. And in that rawness, in that absence of politeness, you get to who you actually are, what you actually believe, what actually matters. And that truth, that honest, unmediated relationship with yourself and reality, that's something most people never get because they're too busy filling every moment with noise to avoid the discomfort of actually being present with themselves. So here's what you do with this understanding. Here's how you stop apologizing for loving silence and start claiming it as the advantage it is. You stop forcing yourself into environments that drain you just to prove you're normal. You stop feeling guilty for wanting to be alone. You stop treating your preference for quiet like it's something to overcome. And you start protecting it, prioritizing it, building your life around it instead of against it. Because the world will take every minute of silence you give it. Will fill every moment with noise if you let it. Will make you believe that constant connection is health, when really it's just distraction, just avoidance, just the collective agreement to never be alone with uncomfortable thoughts. And you don't have to participate in that. You don't have to pretend that parties energize you, that small talk fulfills you, that you need the same things everyone else needs. You just need to accept that you're different, that different is fine, that loving silence makes you part of a minority but not a defect. And that minority, that group of people who prefer depth to noise, quality to quantity, silence to chaos, they're often the ones doing the most interesting work, creating the most meaningful things, thinking the most original thoughts, because they have what loud people don't, which is space quiet, the ability to hear themselves think without constant interference. And that ability, that capacity for silence, that's not something to fix, that's something to weaponize, to leverage, to use as the competitive advantage it is. Because while everyone else is drowning in noise, distracted by stimulation, exhausted by the performance of constant connection, you're in the silence, thinking clearly, creating deeply, existing authentically. And that existence, that quiet, powerful presence that doesn't need validation or visibility or constant noise to prove its worth, that's not weakness, that's not isolation, that's not avoidance, that's strength, that's autonomy. That's the kind of self-knowledge that only comes from spending time in silence, from being comfortable with yourself. From understanding that you don't need to be loud to be valuable, don't need to be visible to be important, don't need to fill every moment with noise to prove you're alive. You just need to love the silence, protect the silence, use the silence, and let everyone else keep their noise, keep their chaos, keep their exhausting performance of sociability while you do what you do best, which is exist in the quiet, think in the stillness, create in the space that noise can never touch. And that's not antisocial, that's not broken, that's just you, loving silence for exactly the reasons you should. Because silence isn't empty, it's where everything worth finding actually lives.